This evening, as part of our continuing series on Paul's big mistake, we're going to be looking at the record in Acts 27 of the storm and shipwreck that he went through. I covered the same chapter, the same record, just a year ago in a teaching called Safely Through the Storm, which you can find on YouTube on our Church in the Home channel. That's what it's called, the Church in the Home. And in that teaching, I covered a lot of detail I will not be covering this evening. I had behind me a map up there, and I had my hand a little pointer, and I showed you the route that they took and so forth. And I went into some real detail about Paul's companions and that kind of detail. You can go to that if you want to learn more about the record, but I won't be getting into those same detail. Instead, I will be getting into some other details that I haven't gone into before, as well as looking at the record from a different perspective. After spending 2 full years in Caesarea, Paul is finally on the move. He is finally moving towards Rome and to appear before Caesar. Something that he knows is going to happen, something God told him from right after he was first taken prisoner, right after he was first arrested. And God told him then that everything would be okay, that all the stuff he was going to go through, don't worry, because you have to testify of me in Rome. And that's going to happen. And he's getting closer to it. But on the way, Paul, who has figuratively been in a storm for this long time now, is caught up in a literal storm as well. You know, in that teaching I referred to, I called it Safely Through the Storm, and I talk in there about the storms of life and how God will see us through them. And whenever you're caught up in a storm, it seems like it'll never end. This has been a long time for Paul. It's been better than 2 years now. But whenever you find yourself in one of these turbulent situations in life, where your life is turmoil and it's upsetting and all these things are happening, you just wonder, when is this going to end? When are we going to get back to normal? When is life going to feel like it should again? Well, I'm certain that Paul had good reason to feel that way. And yet, he just continues to trust God. He continues to look to God to take care of him. And trust that God is going to deliver him. I don't know why at times storms come up in life, why we find ourselves in these situations. And it's obvious not only from the experience of everyone, but also from the record of the Scripture, that happens. Persecution happens, tribulations happen, pressures happen. God tells us that in His Word. And God never promises that we will have a life of smooth sailing. But He does promise that He will always deliver us from the storms of life. And keep that in mind and look at how God takes care of them as we get into this record in Acts 27. And you can turn there. And we'll begin looking at the voyage in verse 1. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. That wasn't the name of a rock band or an orchestra. Augustus' band, talking about this cohort of soldiers. And this fellow Julius, he is the centurion, which means he's specifically over 100 soldiers. Although on this trip, I'm not quite sure if there were that number, or give or take a few. Altogether, I know there were 276 souls. How many of those were soldiers? How many of those were made up of Paul's company and other prisoners? That I'm not sure. It doesn't give us a breakdown. Augustus banned, it's not referring to the Emperor Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Augustus, like the term Caesar itself, is used as a title. It's not just referring to a specific person. The first one, named Augustus, was also known as Octavian. He's the one that follows right after Julius Caesar. Well, you got those other three guys if you know the history. Mark Antony, all those guys, we won't get into that. But nonetheless, the next big Caesar is Augustus Caesar, Octavian. But then from that point on, you've got others. Any Caesar, any emperor is referred to as either a Caesar or sometimes Augustus. In this case, the specific emperor that we are talking about at this time is Nero. Nero, you know him from his fiddling days, right? You've heard of that? Nero fiddled while Rome burnt. Some of you have heard of that. So Nero was the emperor. He was the emperor that under him the real strong persecution of Christians begins in Rome. But that's before that's a while down the road here still. Verse 2. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. So they get into this ship of this place, and they launched, and they're going to initially just travel along the coastline of Asia as they're working their way up towards Italy. And we, it says, includes, as it goes on to say in the latter part of that verse, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. So, two people we know are part of that us, part of that we, that is referred to by that plural pronoun, is Luke and Aristarchus. Don't know if there were any others of Paul's company, but we know that those two are there. There is no indication that Luke or Aristarchus were prisoners at this time with Paul. And it would seem to point that they were not, because it talks about we, Luke and Aristarchus being one of that company. There were others initially that went with Paul to Jerusalem. But then, as soon as Paul gets arrested from that point on in Acts, the pronouns switch, and it's no longer we, it's just Paul being referred to through all those different tribulations, all those different trials that he went through. From the time that the mob first turns on him, from the time he goes to the temple, it is Paul. And the others would not be there. Certainly Aristarchus would not be, because he is clearly a Gentile, and he would not have been taken into the temple. So they weren't arrested. Even at this point, even the council, the Sanhedrin, had no beef with those guys. And yet, here they are on the ship. So they apparently voluntarily decided to join Paul on his travels to Rome to be with them as he went through this stuff. There's some loyal support, huh? Verse 3. And the next day we touched at Sidon, a city, and Julius, that centurion, courteously entreated Paul. It means he treated him with friendliness, and he gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. So here when they stop at this port of Sidon along the way, Julius, the centurion, tells Paul, hey, while we're here, you want to go see your friends in town? Go ahead, be with the believers, have a nice little believer meeting with them, enjoy yourself. The ship leaves at this time, you better be on it, but otherwise, you go and be refreshed. Again, just seeing how God, every step of the way, is doing his best for Paul. How in this bad situation, he is still making things as good as he possibly can for Paul every step of the way. Verse 4. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed unto Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So now they're starting to change their route a little bit because already the winds are not cooperating. The winds are not cooperating, and these vessels, the ship that he was on, typical of the ships of that day, were not as easy to navigate and sail as certainly they are now, or would have been in the time of the great discoveries, explorers like Magellan and Columbus and so forth. We'll get into more of that in a little bit here. Verse 5. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. They're changing boats here. They're changing ships. You know, they've been going along the coast. They're about to head into the open waters of the Mediterranean. And already winds are very uncooperative, and they change ships, perhaps for a bigger one. Verse 7. And when we had sailed slowly many days, not because they were just taking a leisurely cruise, but because, again, it's difficult to do that, to sail, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, not allowing us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmone. And hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. Fair Havens, we have a Fair Havens not far from here, up on Lake Ontario. We also have Syracuse, and it talks about both those places, but don't get confused. He wasn't here, okay? This was places that were named the same thing. Verse 9. Now when much time was spent, and time spent because, you know, they're just not able to move as quickly as they would like to. They've got a certain plan here. When they were planning this voyage, they started at a time where it would seem that they had every reason to be able to expect that they could get to where they were wanting to get to Italy, to Rome, before winter set in, before things got bad, before the weather changed, and they were going to face all this bad weather. But even before any of the weather starts to really shift, they run into bad weather, and that has slowed them down to the point now where it's presenting a real problem. And the time was spent in sailing, and when sailing was now dangerous. It's been, before this time, difficult, but now we're going from difficult to dangerous. It's one thing when the current's against you, and it's hard to paddle your kayak going against it. It's another when it's throwing you all over the place, and now you're concerned if you and your kayak are going to make it. Well, he wasn't in a kayak, but he must have felt not much better than that as you read the record. And sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past. It was dangerous not because of the fast, but because of the time of year that would have indicated. The fast that it's referring to is most likely the Day of Atonement on the 10th of Tishri. And that occurred in late September, early October, according to our calendar. So this time of year, and today was real nice, but you know, that wasn't the case for them. It was a dangerous time. This was a time when the weather got really unpredictable. Verse 10. Well, no, verse 9. Finish that. Because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. And verse 10, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with much hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. He admonished. That word admonish means to warn. Paul comes to the soldiers, the sailors, all these guys that are responsible, and he gives them this warning. He warns them that the voyage is going to be with much hurt, that they are going to run into some serious trouble here. And not only of the ship and the cargo, but also of their own very lives. Did Paul decide this based on his knowledge and experience of sailing? No. How did he perceive this? How did he come to this conclusion? By revelation. And yet, does he mention that? No. He doesn't. He doesn't tell them, hey, fellas, hold it. God came to me and told me that we should stop. We should not go. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. Why not? Well, word of wisdom, that's all I can tell you. It's not that he's shy to talk about God. He's certainly proven that one. And the next time he warns them, he certainly will make it clear where he's getting this information from. But on this occasion, for whatever reason, he tells them. But that's all he does is tell them that they're going to run into trouble. Nevertheless, verse 11, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. You know, of course he did, right? I mean, who are you going to listen to? A prisoner or the guy that owns the ship, the master of the ship? Here's the captain. You going to believe this prisoner, or are you going to believe me, the captain, who owns this ship and has spent years and years of sailing these waters? Of course he would believe them. Of course he would. It's interesting to see how Paul handles all of this situation. That he doesn't reveal that he has revelation. That he doesn't tell them, hey, there's a big story. Let's pray. Let's all get together and do a big prayer meeting here. You know, people always want to pray. Christians today, they want to pray every time they're in some kind of bad weather situation. But again, that's not what Paul does, at least with these fellows. You know, a storm. Well, why is this such a big deal? Jesus calmed a storm. He was there. It says that that we will do the same works as Jesus Christ and greater works, because he was going on to the Father. Paul believed that. Paul's done all kinds of great miracles. Think about some of the miracles that he's done. He not long ago, some kid had the nerve to fall asleep in his teaching and fell down and died, and Paul just left him there because you fall asleep in Paul's teaching. Oh, no, he didn't. He went and raised him from the dead. So Paul's capable of doing great miracles, right? He's proven that. Why didn't he just calm the storm like Jesus did? That wasn't the revelation. Revelation is specific to a circumstance. And you can never say, because this is what was done in this record, this is what's going to be done on this occasion. Nor can you say, because this is the way Jesus handled this or Paul handled this, this is the way I should handle the same or a similar situation if it comes up in my life. You can't even go on, well, one time I lost something really important in the woods and God told me exactly where to go, and I can just, next time I lose something, I can just count on doing that same thing. It's, again, God's choice or prerogative to give you the revelation, and it differs with circumstances. And Paul was wise enough and understood the Word of God enough to be able to do that. They're not taking heed to Paul's warning. And I'm sure it's not lost on Paul that the reason why he was there in the first place was because he did not take heed to a prior warning that God gave him. He would not be on that ship in the first place. He would not be in bonds in the first place had he listened to God's warning back in Caesarea when he was there with the believers as a free man. And God told him not to go to Jerusalem in the first place. And he had that warning, and he did not heed it. And now here he is again, having just set off originally from Caesarea. And he's got this warning that nobody is listening to. The first time he was warned, when God warned him not to go in the first place, he didn't take heed to it, not willing to listen. In this case, he's got no choice. He's got no choice. It's not a matter of not being willing to listen to the warning. He has no choice. He can't say, okay, if you're going to go, I'm going to stay here. I'm not going with you. He's a prisoner. He can't do that. So here he is in this circumstance beyond his control, what he cannot control. And yet God has told him that if they continue, they're going to run into some serious trouble. And the only revelation he's got to this point is that that trouble is not only going to be of the ship, but also of their own lives. How'd you like to be in that circumstance? And yet, Paul doesn't freak out. He doesn't freak out. He doesn't get all like, oh my gosh, He stays calm. Verse 12. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, it wasn't, even though it was called Fair Havens, it wasn't a good enough place to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attend unto to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. They could have stayed where they were, but they said, oh no, this isn't the best place. We'll just go up the coast a little bit farther. There's a much better place to stay. Verse 14. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. Soon as they set off, they run into this tempest, this great storm at sea. Big enough that they're giving names to it, just like we had. What was the last hurricane we had? No, this is because we live in New York. If we were in Florida, I'm sure we'd all remember. Verse 15. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. The ship's caught in this great wind, and they just cannot control it. So they just let the wind take the ship. Because to try to do otherwise would have only caused more harm to the ship. That much they understood. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. They had much work to get that boat under control. And I'm going to read to you here some excerpts from this book, The Life and Epistles of St. Paul, by Coney Barrenhausen. A great historical work that gives you a lot of the detail and background of specifically here, what travel by sea in ancient times was like. Verse 17. Which, when they had taken up, talking about trying to keep the boat together, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, which is actually sandbars, not quicksands in the middle of the Mediterranean, but sandbars, they strake sail and so were driven. Read you here about a couple of things referred to in this verse. Helps and undergirding the ship. In consequence of the extreme danger to which they were exposed from leaking, it was customary to take to sea as part of their ordinary gear undergirders, which were simply ropes for passing around the hull of the ship and thus prevent the planks from starting or separating. So this is their plan, okay? In another place, I should get to it, read to you. They had, ships of that day had one main mast, and not the great array of sails and things were not arranged as they were in later times. having that one main mast and one main sail, not that there weren't other sails, but one main one, the wind, when they were in a strong wind, put incredible stress on that mast. And in so doing, it, you can kind of picture this, it would cause that force to be spread down into the ship and start to put a strain on everything. So that caused leaking, yes, for the boat to start to leak. And that was the most common way that ships caused shipwreck, was from them starting to leak and take on water, and they would flounder, in other words, start to fill with water to the point where now they start to sink and they're easily thrown everywhere. So to try to keep the ship together, standard equipment were these thick ropes, these helps to undergird. What they would do was, okay, everybody grab the rope and we're going to wrap it around the whole boat and tie it up real tight to try to, with a rope, keep the boat together. Yeah. I don't think I'd like to be on that ship, would you? No. Verse 18. And being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. They got rid of any cargo that they could. Again, because they're concerned about sinking. And you don't want extra stuff weighing that ship down. 19. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. Read you a little bit more. Okay, we find in these ancient ships the large mast, what I just talked about. And I won't read that. That's basically what I just told you, so I won't bother to read it to you. I'll hold off on the other stuff. I will read this part. The ship of the Greek and Roman mariner, sailors, was comparatively rude both in its build and its rig. The hull was not laid down with the fine lines with which we are so familiar in the competing vessels of England and America, and the arrangement of the sails exhibited little of that complicated distribution, yet effective combination of mechanical forces which are mired in the East Indian or modern frigate. So again, these ships, you've just got to appreciate how crude they are. Continuing. Verse 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. Many days that the storm is so heavy that they cannot see the sun during the day or stars at night. And that's not just difficult in terms of seeing, but it made navigation impossible. The Greeks and Romans were ignorant of the use of the compass. The instruments with which they took observations must have been rude compared with our modern quadrants and sextants. And we have no reason to believe that their vessels were provided with nautical charts, not even charts to go by. And thus, when neither sun nor stars appeared, and the sky gave indication of danger, they hesitated to try the open sea. So, the open sea may have been less treacherous in terms of shallow waters and rocks and things like that, but without a way to navigate, there's no idea what would happen to them. This is, I think, a good time to point out. All hope, it says, was taken away. And that was true of, I'm sure, the sailors, and true of the centurion and the soldiers and other passengers. It certainly wasn't true for Paul. Not only was it not true for Paul in terms of he's demonstrated that kind of confidence in God, for him, this is no new thing especially. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 25, Paul talks about the things that he's gone through, and in the latter part of that verse, he says thrice, 3 times, I suffered shipwreck. So, and that's not even counting this one. 3 times before, he's been in a shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep. He spent an entire 24 hours swimming around in that sea, most likely that sea, some sea. So 3 times he's gone through this. 3 times. You know, after the first time, I'm never getting on another ship. If I'm in a shipwreck, I'm done sailing. You know, here he doesn't have any choice, but it doesn't matter. Paul was just trusting God. And again, no guarantee that he would not be in these kind of situations. And shipwrecks were just that common because of the state of shipbuilding and navigation. Shipwrecks were so common. You know, people are nervous to fly when, you know, I don't know anybody, you know. Okay, I personally don't. Some people in this room do know people that in planes have crashed. But nonetheless, you know, this was a common occurrence. This was a common occurrence. And yet, Paul trusts God. To the point that in verse 21, but after long abstinence, after Paul has just kept to himself for quite a while here, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me. You should have listened. He's not afraid to say, I told you so, is he? And not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. I told you this was going to happen. And the fact that he did tell them that first time, even though they didn't listen, certainly he has a lot more credibility this time now, doesn't he? And now, verse 22, you should have listened and not lose from Crete and gain this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. Well, I'm sure that was one that they thought he was off his rocker. Be of good cheer. Be happy. Be positive. What are you talking about? Look what's going on. For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. No loss of any man's life, but of the ship. Yeah, nothing we can do to save the ship. That one's gone. But even though the original warning said that there would be loss to life, that revelation has changed. And now there will be no loss of life if you do what I'm telling you this time. Verse 23. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Paul tells them just like it is. An angel came to me this night, and he told me, Paul, don't worry. God's got you covered. God's taking care of you. You're going to go to Rome. You're going to be before Caesar. And not only you, but everybody that's with you, they get to benefit from God's care and protection on your life. Verse 25. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. Now he's going to tell them the reason why they should be of good cheer. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island first. He says, be of good cheer because I believe God. God told me this, and I believe God. Even if you don't, I believe God. And all you got to do is listen to what I'm telling you. Because I believe God that God will take care of me. Boy, what a great confidence to have. And that's the confidence that we can have in every situation, every storm of life that we're ever in. I believe God, and therefore everything's going to be okay. Verse 27. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, 14th night that they've been in this storm. 14 nights. 14 nights. Adria, and that's the Adriatic Sea, part of the Mediterranean Sea. About midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country and sounded. That's like they drop the rope, Mark Twain. They figure out how deep it is. And found it 20 fathoms. A fathom is roughly about 6 feet. So 6 times 20, what do we have? 120. Not too tough, right? And when they had gone a little farther, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Well, who can do that math? It's about 90 feet, okay? About 90 feet. Getting shallower, right? This is not a good thing. The ship's just getting into shallower waters, and that means more and more rocks, more and more danger. Then fearing, verse 29, lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. Probably the greatest understatement in this whole state. Wish for the day. You bet they did, right? They just want this night to be over. They want this night to be over. They want this storm to be over. Verse 30. And as the shipmen were about to do what? Flee out of the ship. Wait a minute. What were they told? They had to stay on the ship, but these guys are going to jump ship. When they had let down the boat into the sea, they got a lifeboat here, under cover, they're trying to sneak away doing this as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. So, we're not doing anything, we're just dropping the anchors over here. If you hear a splash, that's just the anchors, as they're trying to drop this boat into the water that they can climb in and they think get safely away. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. It's not just them. It's not just their necks they're risking here. If these guys bail on you, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it. Verse 32. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. That was the end of that, right? They didn't take too much convincing. Verse 33. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. 14 days they haven't eaten, they've been fasting. And that's not because they were prayer and fasting. They were fasting because they've been thrown around so much for 14 days, nobody wants to eat. If you've ever been in some rough waters, you understand that one. Verse 34. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. You need some strength. You got some swimming to do here, folks. You got to be strong. You need to have something to eat. For there shall not a hair fall from the head of any of you. Wow. Did they deserve it? Did these sailors deserve that? I like, what's his name? Julius. He's a nice guy. I'm happy for him to cash in on this, but I don't know about any of the other ones if they deserved it. And yet, not a hair was going to fall from the head of any of them. That's the magnitude of God's grace. Verse 36. Verse 30, continuing 35. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Got some food, prayed for the food, must have been a great prayer because these fellows start to cheer up afterwards. Verse 36, then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were all in the ship 216 souls. That's 276 people. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. Got rid of whatever they didn't eat. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek within the shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. They're going to try to go into this little creek going up into the shore. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea and loosed the rudder bands, and that's the word rudder is plural in the Greek, and as well as bands. Ships of those days didn't have one just single rudder. They had two rudders. And again, not the best design. And the bands kind of held those in place when they wanted to just try to stay going in one direction. So they loosed that and they hoist up the mainsail to the wind and made towards shore. And falling into the place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained immovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. So you can picture that, right? You know, the ship, the forepart, it gets stuck in this place, and it ain't moving, but the back is just getting beat all up with the sea, and all just starts breaking apart. Verse 42. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. Well, that's gratitude for you, isn't it? But the soldiers, they were responsible for the prisoners. And if the prisoners did escape, you know who would have been killed? The soldiers. So that was their thinking. But the centurion, good old Julius, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards, and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. So whoever can swim, you guys just dive in and start swimming. The rest of you grab a hold of something and hang on for dear life. But you've got a promise here. A promise that there won't one hair fall from your head. God's that gracious, and His grace extends toward all of us, that big, that when you get on a plane, you can have the confidence that God will take care of you, and nothing's going to happen to that plane when you're on it if you believe God like Paul did. If you get on a ship, no matter what kind of weather you run into, you're going to be okay because God's with you. It's great to know that in those circumstances. It's great to understand the magnitude of the grace of God. Not only in those kind of circumstances, but to realize that God's grace and blessings are so big on your life that every day those that are close to you receive that grace as well. You know, as a parent, I've always had such thankfulness and confidence that because of God's love and grace on my lives, that extended to my family and those under my care as well. I believe that that's something we can claim. That we can claim because God just loves us that big. He is that gracious and that powerful. And we can trust our Father in that way. God bless you.